Hey, what's up, everyone? Welcome to the Session X podcast. In this week's episode, I'm going to tell you about the best breath I have ever taken. I've been obsessed with action sports my entire life. A single universal language of pure stoke. In these timeless moments, we experience the greatest joys and purest emotions. Life makes sense, completely present, in harmony with nature. In studying the evolution of extreme sports, it's easy to identify a direct link to ultimate human performance, monk-like focus, body and mind mastery, mind-blowing applications of courage, confidence, and creativity. But where does it come from? How do we get it? And most importantly, how can more people access these superhuman qualities? My name is Matt Schollard. I'm a peak performance and mindset coach, and I'm also an extreme athlete. Together with some of the greatest action sport professionals on earth, we'll drop into the powerful lessons found within their chosen disciplines and explore how you can apply them toward your own journey of greatness. Welcome to Session X Podcast, the intersection of extreme sports and peak performance. So switching it up a little bit in this week's episode, taking a break from the full-length, long endurance efforts with a featured guest. And I want to take some time to share a story. I think I'll do this periodically where we'll take a break from the longer formatted shows, where I typically try and let my guests do most of the speaking. I'm trying to extrapolate from them what their definition of peak performance is and how they strategize and build their life around whatever their chosen sport or sports are to achieve their definition of peak performance. But something that is very near and dear to my heart is my own journey of peak performance. And I definitely provide a lot of anecdotal lessons to my coaching clients, which are quite challenging to get spots in these days, thankfully. But I definitely wanted to have a platform with which to share some really influential stories and not hijack from any guests that I may have on the show. So that's this week's episode. As I mentioned earlier, I want to tell you about the best breath I've ever taken and why that's important. And hopefully you can gain some type of insight toward your own journey through that story. So the story begins back when I was a pararescue student, long time ago. I had made it through the pararescue indoctrination course, which is by some considered the most difficult training in the military. At the time, it was like a 90% attrition rate. It means that out of 100 people, 90 plus would not make it through this training. I did make it through. I was successful. And then the first stop after that. So the reason that the pararescue indoctrination course is so challenging is, one, they're trying to test a candidate's mettle. They're trying to see what your mental and physical and emotional limits are if you have what it takes to go out and perform one of the most difficult missions in the entire U.S. military or even in the world. So they can't just take a person and thrust them into combat, into real world scenarios and hope that they'll perform or, rise to the occasion. So they have, and this is a common amongst all special operations selection courses. There needs to be a controlled environment with which to test what a candidate will do. You can't just have a kid off the street and says, "Oh yeah, man, if I'm ever in that situation, I'm going to rise to the top. I'm going to, defend my team. I'm going to perform with bravery. I'm going to not quit." Whatever. You can't take somebody at face value. So you need to put them through a series of tests. In the case of the pararescue program, it's 2 years of every day being the most difficult day of your life, getting harder, more difficult. The standards just are ever increasing. And when I went through the first 12 weeks, the pararescue indoctrination course was sort of the entry to even go and learn all of the skills required to be a pararescueman. First, you would attend selection or indoc, and then from there, you would go on to all these different schools, learning various methods of getting to work, so to speak. You go to combat diver, where you learn how to dive subsurface using a drager or a non-rebreather, so you can have the advantage of stealth underwater. You go to airborne, where you learn to jump out of a plane, static line, and free or fall with 1,200 feet with your gear so that you can hit an objective. From there, you go to free fall school where you learn precision parachuting, high altitude, low opening, or high altitude, high opening, so that you can jump from a plane at a higher altitude undetected, fly behind enemy lines, get to your objective, and then get out. You go and learn EMT basic, EMT paramedic. You go through the Joint Special Operations medical course where you learn these skills that are very above and beyond what a street paramedic would do in combat. So then it has that intellectual component that is sort of a difference from a lot of the other conventional special operations forces where you have to be book smart, you have to be good at taking exams, you have to be good at studying, all the while maintaining this elite level physical fitness. Then from there, you go to survival school where you learn how to evade capture or survive behind enemy lines if your aircraft were ever to be shot down. Then there's a 6-month kind of putting it all together program known as the Pararescue Apprentice Course, where you are learning very crucial and specific skills to being a pararescueman with all of the additional training that you had previously received now being able to be applied to being, or the actual function and job of a special operations pararescueman. That program has some additional medicine. They call it dirt medicine or field medicine, where you're basically practicing care under fire and how to perform some life-saving interventions in a direct combat situation. There's mountain and rope rescue. There's a greater air operations component where you're doing more work with helicopters, fast roping, rappelling out of helicopters, riding the hoist, jumping out of helicopters into the ocean, riding a hoist out of the ocean. And then you're jumping out of planes with parachutes, both static line and free fall, into the ocean, jumping out after Zodiac boats so that you can perform an open water, middle of nowhere rescue mission that's commonly practiced for previously when the space shuttle was operational. And I'll tell some space shuttle NASA support stories in a future episode. Today is all about the best breath I've ever taken. Back to the apprentice course. Then it's on to like a weapons and tactics where you learn advanced movements and, combat, close quarters battle, how to operate multiple sources of death and destruction, grenades and multiple firearms. And it's all tied together in a FTX, a field training exercise, where you're basically operating as a full-blown pararescueman in training. That's 2 years after the day one start of becoming a PJ to get to that point. But I want to go back to right after selection. So I was one of the few that made it through my indoctrination course. My weak spot was running. The standard was a 7-minute mile for miles for each week is an increasing distance in the weekly evaluation. So it starts at 1.5 miles in 10.5 minutes, all the way up to a 6-mile final evaluation, followed by a 4,000-meter swim, a number of calisthenics, and then some water confidence drills. But water confidence was my jam. I grew up surfing with just this huge affinity for the water, swimming. It was very near and dear to my heart. I became a pararescueman because of the movie The Perfect Storm, where this guy, I think I've mentioned it in previous shows, jumps out of a helicopter in this massive turbulent storm and swims over and all calmly and coolly rescues this victim of a sinking ship in the middle of a hurricane. So I leave Indoc and I go to the combat diver school. Now, there's a lot of divers in the military. There, especially in the Navy, there's salvage diving and there's underwater ship repair. There's deep sea diving. There's just like general reconnaissance. But there's a very select group of people in the world who attend combat diver. It's reserved for Air Force Special Warfare, pararescuemen, and combat controllers. Navy SEALs are combat divers, and there's a select group of Army Special Forces units that attend combat diver. So it's a very select group of people that go through this course, and it has sort of a legacy to it that it's a notoriously challenging school. Part of why the pararescue program likes to send candidates out of Indoc straight to the dive school, at least when I went through, was because they had a greater chance of graduating, having just finished up Indoc, their water confidence should be through the roof, and they get to this course and it's quite challenging. So it starts off kind of with a lot of didactics, lecture, learning dive physiology, dive science, the physics behind it, all the gas laws, how to operate equipment, and it's all hands-on. It's very classroom oriented. And then from there, in a typical crawl, walk, run progression, it moves into the pool where you learn. When I went to dive school, I'd never scuba dived in my life. Scuba dove. I'd never been attached to a scuba rig before when I went to dive school. So I'm in a pool, and day one is real simple. Put your face in the water, breathe, blow some bubbles, just kind of get familiar and comfortable with your equipment. And each day throughout pool week gets more and more difficult. Now, the military is great about reinforcing safety procedures. Like, they definitely want to preserve their resources, and by resources I mean people. They don't want people to become injured or harmed in training accidents or in real world applications. So there's a water-based safety drill with combat diver known as in-water proficiency. And what that is you have a sequence. The military loves sequences. They love drills and checklists, which the more you dive into the world of peak performance, checklists are absolutely mandatory. They're so important. They have clear parameters, and they have goals, and they provide immediate feedback, and they sort of give you a pathway as to where you're going. So this in-water proficiency sequence is in the event that your scuba gear becomes fouled in any way. You're diving subsurface and you get fouled up in a net, or you run out of air, or you are tumbled in waves and crash on a reef. Whatever the scenario may be, the idea is that if you should experience any type of problem with your scuba gear, you have a sequence that allows you to go through and basically identify all sources of potential problem, and then to mitigate those problems along the way. Culminating with, if the problem deems your air source unworthy or not capable of sustaining life anymore, you then ditch your equipment. So the sequence it's been a long time, but what I recall is you reach back, you turn your air all the way on, back it off a quarter of a turn. So that solves if your air somehow gets turned off. You then trace your regulator from start to finish. That sorts out if you have any knots in your regulator. That's basically most of what I can remember, but there's a sequence and it just continues. Things of like checking your buoyancy and making sure that everything is where it should be with all of your equipment. Now, throughout the week of dive school at Pool Week, you're practicing this in-water proficiency every single day. Even if you're just kneeling on the bottom of the pool in 3 feet of water, face just barely below subsurface, you sit there when you're not practicing whatever other skill that you might be working on for the day, buddy breathing or some safety procedures. You have time where you just sit there and you go through this checklist. You practice it, trace your regulator, breathe, okay, clear the regulator. And it has this like real muscle memory ingrained repetition. And for the most part, it was a really relaxing evolution when you were in the pool, and perhaps whatever you were doing for that day, whatever the focus was, that practice of in-water proficiency was a chance to kind of just like cool out, meditate underwater, focus, go through this repetitive reinforcing these muscle patterns, reinforcing the mental checklist, calming and soothed by the sounds of the bubbles, just kind of relaxing. Now, the final phase of Pool Week, before you can finish Pool Week and transition into the open water to start doing distance swims and search dives, and then even progressing on to closed circuit diving after that, you have to complete an exercise called one-man confidence. Now, for some reason, I don't know how this didn't permeate through the pipeline when you're an indoc student, or a lot of times people who are in various stages of the program like to share horror stories. For whatever reason, I didn't know about one-man confidence until like Tuesday of Pool Week, and we were like doing this one-man event on Friday. And it turns out that this is actually a ridiculously hard evolution that a lot of people don't pass dive school on their first go, or even get removed from training altogether because they cannot pass one-man confidence. So what it is you're at the bottom of a pool in, I think it was 12, maybe 14, but we'll say 12 feet of water. You have on a blacked out mask. So your mask is completely black. They put duct tape inside of it. So you can't see anything. And you're on the bottom of the pool and you have to kneel. If at any point, and there's a whole set of fail criteria, which I'll talk about in a second. But the idea is you kneel on the bottom of the pool and you go through this checklist, this in-water proficiency checklist. Now, the instructors will come down for the duration of this one-man confidence for 20 or 30 minutes. It's a very long evolution. And they provide harassment. Harassment is anything from turning off your air, knocking the regulator out of your mouth, checking you, spinning you around, flipping you, disorientating, continuing to tie knots in your regulator, and all sorts of progressively difficult things. And you, on the bottom of the pool, have to maintain protection, control yourself. When the violent motion stops or the assault of the instructor stops, you then go through your whole process, the checklist. You start from the beginning. Now, if at any point you put your feet on the bottom of the pool, you fail because the instructor's thinking that you're about to panic and you're going to blast to the surface, possibly having an air gas embolism or some type of barotrauma. So that's failure criteria. If at any point you become too hypoxic or uncomfortable and you want to stop the evolution, you just give the out of air symbol. And a second later, the safety diver who's sitting and watching from a very close position will put a regulator in your mouth, give you a nice good air source, and the exercise is over and you fail. Now, this happened, my evolution was on a Friday. And there was the threat, one, of class liberty being revoked. So that meaning we wouldn't be able to go downtown for the weekend, which those periods of being able to leave base and, go downtown for whatever, at least Friday night was a very welcome distraction for a lot of people. I didn't want to, one, fail the evolution, and then two, be confined to base, but I mostly didn't want to fail. So there was an instructor who'll remain unnamed, who had a particularly harsh reputation, we'll say, and he definitely did not like people to pass any of the things that he did as an instructor. It was sort of his thing where he was a little bit above and beyond what was required. I don't know if there was any justification for it or if it was just an ego thing on his part, but that's how this guy showed up. And I walked out onto the pool deck and I was assigned him as my instructor for one-man confidence. And he's holding on to the gunnel of the pool and he's looking up at me and he looks me dead in the eye and he says, "Nobody is passing me on one man today." Now, I'm not necessarily a really competitive person, but I also don't like people imposing limits on me. I don't want, if the parameters have some element of fairness to them or some element of predictability, that's good enough for me. And that's why when I have gone on to compete later in life outside of a combat scenario, I was really intrigued at the idea, as long as there was an element of fairness to it. I think big wave surfing is fair because the ocean is relatively predictable. I think that a lot of the extreme sports that I participate in and a lot of my clients and friends participate in are quite fair. You show up prepared, you have an understanding of the conditions, and you either rise to the occasion or you don't. And that's very different for me than my experience with combat, where as a combat special operator, it doesn't matter how physically fit or well-trained or well-rehearsed your mission is. There's always the wild card and the unknown variabilities of what could happen to you. And this is, it's evident in every single day of every combat deployment I've ever had, where the most random, wild occurrences of unfortunate events happen. So that aside, I get onto the pool deck and I learn that the instructor that I have for one-man confidence is just decided that he's not going to allow anybody to pass him today. Now, at first, this kind of spiked a little bit of anxiety in me. I was like, well, man, I really don't want to fail this evolution. I don't want to have that looming over my head going into the weekend, knowing that I'll have to retest on Monday, knowing that I have to sit on base all weekend. sort of stewing over it and worrying or developing an aversion to this particular exercise. I'd rather just get it done. Also, I had worked too hard to graduate indoc, to make it to combat dive school in the first place, that I didn't want to let my instructors down who believed in me to support my future success as a pararescueman. And I didn't want the guy telling me that I wasn't going to pass. So I committed to doing whatever it took on my part to passing. So I made this conscious decision. I said, so I felt some anxiety. I was like, you know what? I've been through a lot. I've been through, multiple hell weeks. I've experienced a lot of adversity. I have failed evolutions at Indoc. I've been threatened with removal from the program. And I persevered and I made it through. What is this 20 or 30 minutes on the bottom of this pool where I'm very comfortable in this, this state of hypoxia and challenging water confidence. I can do this. So I talked myself down and got rid of the anxiety, put on the blackout mask, do my giant stride entry, sink to the bottom of the pool. And there was something about having the mask blacking out my sight. It allowed me to really go internal, which with our five senses, that's how we perceive the world around us, right? We see, we take in a lot of visual information, we hear, we smell, we touch, we taste. That is how our brain drives this container of a body to experience the world around us. When you remove a sense, it heightens some of the others. Now, taking away your ability to see at the bottom of a pool when you're going to be going through some pretty violent maneuvers isn't exactly something that somebody would, potentially invite, like, oh, I want to experience this. But for me, I found it heightened my other sense, maybe like my sixth sense. It heightened my intuition. It heightened my ability to be introspective in that moment and not focused on the external environment around me. So I began my sequence. You don't know when the first hits are coming or what they're going to be. So I'm going through my sequence, but the first thing I did was I attached to the sound, the really meditative sound of the bubbles escaping. If you've ever scuba dived or scuba dove, the sound of like the air passing, it has this really calming and soothing sound to it. So I told myself, I said, as long as I can hear the bubbles, it's going to be fine, right? Hear the bubbles, no troubles. I was like, okay, sink into this meditative state. Breathe when I can. Take the deepest and most nourishing, proper breaths that I can when I can. When I can breathe, those are those moments, those are those little vacations, microseconds of relief. Lean into those. And then I just settled in for the experience. First thing, boom, instructor checks me with his shoulder, drives me into my ribs, knocks the air out of my lungs, pushes the regulator in my mouth, turns my air off, grabs me, starts violently shaking me. And I'm just balled up and I'm trying to protect myself and I'm trying to keep, all the things that I'm doing, making sure that my feet don't touch the ground. Oh my God, I forgot to mention a very crucial piece here where in addition to your feet never being able to touch the bottom of the pool, you also have to continuously be exhaling, blowing tiny bubbles out of your mouth. The precious air that you have to be constantly exhaling. If you don't constantly exhale, you fail. All right. So I'm going through this motions all the while. I'm still trying to make sure that I'm exhaling, or at least the safety diver can see that I'm exhaling. I'm not planting my feet. I'm in this, guarding myself. Okay, the violent motion stops. All right. Air all the way on, back off, quarter of a turn, trace my regulator goes in my mouth. As soon as I push to clear the water from my regulator, it gets knocked out of my mouth. So I'm exhaling, bloop, 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 and then I use a little bit more air to clear my regulator. Then when I go to inhale, it's removed from my mouth. The amount of air that I have in my lungs is very finite. And I've been holding my breath at this point for, 30, 45 seconds during the duration of this first attack. Same thing. I can't just stuff the regulator mouth, airline back return, trace the regulator mouth. Okay. I get one wonderful breath. Boom. It starts again. They grab by my manifold and I'm getting spun around. They take the mask and they fill it with water. So now I don't have this nice blacked out environment. Instead, I just have this chlorine swimming pool that's pushing on my face. Now water's starting to seep up into my nose. I'm being spun. I'm being flipped, shook. My regulator is being stuffed, knocked out of my mouth, kicked off the side of the pool. The violent motion ceases. Air on my quarter of a turn, grab the regulator. I have so little air in my lungs. I go to clear, knocks out of my mouth. Oh my God. Air all the way back on. Go through the sequence again. I put it in my mouth. I get a sweet breath. This goes on for 20, 25 minutes. It's just continuously just this onslaught and this barrage of an attack. How this exercise ends is the instructor will tie what is known as a whammy knot or an unrecoverable air source. I forgot to mention all the failing criteria. I'm getting ahead of myself here. So the way that drill ends is you have an unrecoverable air source. No matter how many times you try and get this thing out, you simply can't. So at that point, your air source is deemed inoperable, and you have to ditch your gear and you have to make a controlled ascent to the surface. So imagine you're diving on a wreckage or something and this happens to you. The idea is that you would ditch your gear and make a controlled ascent, exhaling all the way up until you reach the surface. No matter how deep you are, that's the theory behind a controlled ditch. So the whammy knot, if at any point you go to ditch your gear prematurely, you fail the exercise. If you get the whammy knot and you ditch your gear and then you cannot find, let me back up. For this particular exercise, you don't have to do a free ascent. You have to find your regulator and then breathe off of it wherever it may be. You're just doing all of this by feel. So I'm going through this drill and I'm noticing the knots are getting more difficult to untie. And I'm starting to wonder, like, okay, I've been here for a while. The whammy knot might be coming soon. I don't know. I don't want to prematurely go to ditch my gear and then I get a regulator in my mouth and I fail and all this effort has been for nothing. So this is continuing where every time I go to get a breath, the regulator's knocked out of my mouth. It's to the point now where I take 2 breaths and it's knocked out of my mouth. I'm gupping. When I get the regulator, I guard it. I get 1 breath every 40 seconds to a minute and a half, maybe, in all sorts of violent motion. I am more hypoxic than I have ever been in pararescue school to that point, which is saying a lot. I never passed out in training, but I definitely had a very long breath hold. I have a very high tolerance for CO2 buildup. I have a very high tolerance for O2 deficit. I was very well prepared for water confidence, and I am more hypoxic than I've ever been in my life. So this is going on, and I'm starting to feel definitely. I'm comfortable with hypoxia. I'm comfortable with the gupping sensation or those contractions that are like, man, you really need to breathe. But for that, I had never experienced it at that prolonged of an event before. I'd never been so hypoxic for so long, and being forced to make critical decisions. The critical decision being that, am I going to ditch my gear? Is this the whammy knot? Am I there? And I have to be prepared to go through these drills with each hit that the instructor provides. So it's getting to the point where I'm like, okay, I think the whammy knot's going to be getting here pretty soon. So comes down, I'm on the water, I'm on the bottom, I'm gupping, I'm on my knees, I'm letting out my little air bubbles, I'm hypoxic, and I feel some violent motion that feels different than some of the other movements before. And I'm like, this might be the whammy knot, but I'm gonna try to get this air source so that I don't prematurely try to ditch my gear and fail the evolution. So the instructor lets up. I go do my sequence, and I'm like, I can't seem to find my regulator. Now, in my mind, I was trying to find this thing for a long time. I don't know how long it was realistically. I was so deep in flow and trying to get through the evolution, but it was a long time. I finally make the decision. I say, you know what? I'm either going to pass out and then I'm going to fail the exercise, or I'm going to ditch the gear and trust that this is the whammy knot and then go on to the next solution or the next problem I have to solve, which is finding my air source. So I go, I take off, I undo the waist strap, and I start to reach back. And by this point, I was like, well, if it was not the whammy knot, I should have a regulator in my mouth, so I'm pretty sure I have to ditch my gear. So I bring my tanks over my head, I lay them on the ground, and now I have to find this air source. So I'm so hypoxic. I'm gupping. I'm like, I'm losing sensation in my fingertips. I can't see, but if I did, I'm sure I would have, the most minuscule tunnel vision. And I'm just scrambling. And for the first time in the entire exercise, I'm like, you know what? If I give the out of air right now, then all this will end. It'll end. I don't have to worry about this discomfort, this extreme state of panic that I'm feeling. It was overwhelming. I had never felt so hypoxic. I'd seen a lot of people pass out in the pool, and for them, it seemed like a very easy, peaceful thing. And I was like, man, I just will not pass out. Like I was inviting it at this point. For whatever reason, I'm like, I can't pass out. So I have to endure and I have to finish what I started. So I was determined at that point to find my regulator. And I had totally forgotten about the instructor saying that nobody was going to pass. I was so focused on finishing and completing this task that I brought all of my attention and all of my focus inward. And I was like, I'm going to find this regulator. Running my hands over very methodically, and then I feel it. And I push the button and I can hear sweet air bubbles, and I stick my face right on this regulator, which is attached onto in between the two, the twin 80 cylinders. And I stick my mouth on it, and I take the sweetest, most perfect breath I have ever had in my entire life. How many people can say that? Like, this is the best breath I've ever had. That was the best breath I have ever taken, ever. We take 10,000 breaths a day. That was the best one in my 42 years of existence. It was cold. It had a little bit of positive pressure, and it was just this flooding sensation of survival, of perseverance, of enduring, of tenacity, and of accomplishing what I set out to do. I laid there breathing. Who knows if I experienced a little bit of shallow water blackout. I was trying to hold on to consciousness while just breathing, just so deep and so deliberate and so appreciative of the breath. I had totally forgotten what I was even doing. I was just so hyper-focused on this breath. The the safety diver knocks on my mask, lifts it up, and then hands me their regulator to breathe from. So I take a few breaths from that while he undoes the whammy knot, then directs me to my equipment and tells me I'm supposed to hold my scuba tank with a regulator in my mouth and walk on the bottom of the pool up to the shallow end where I'll recover. And the whole while I'm walking, I don't know if I passed at this. I'm like, I think I did, right? I didn't have any of the failure criteria, but I was like, it was the most challenging thing I'd done in the pararescue program so far. And it was so intense. And the instructor said nobody was going to pass. What does my fate hold for me? So I get to the shallow end. I'm instructed to recover my gear and walk out of the pool. And I get out of the pool and I walk, and the instructor's leaning on the gunnel right where he was when I walked by. And I will never forget, he looks up at me with this look of admiration. He looks me right in the eye. He nods, slowly smirks, and he says, "You earned that one." And I said, "Hoo-Yah, Sergeant," and went on. And the feeling that I experienced after that at no point in my life, if I set out to do something, will I ever not succeed. It was that impactful and that meaningful for me that I, in my mind, had overcome a tremendous amount of adversity, a tremendous amount of external challenge that was determined to have me not be successful. I overcame my own most primal instinct, my own the most powerful urge a human can have to breathe for survivability. I was able to overcome that and accomplish the mission. From that day on, I not only knew that I would be successful as a pararescueman, but that I would be successful at every endeavor that I set my mind and committed my efforts to. I went and got the rest of the dive school was wonderful. It was my favorite experience in the whole pipeline. I got an honor graduate from that school, went on through the remainder of the pipeline, and had a very successful career as a pararescueman. Now, I have leveraged that particular test multiple times throughout my career, and I'll tell some more stories as these little shorter podcasts unfold. But where I've used the lessons that I learned from that. But for the purposes of this show and of that story, I want to leave you with this: that no one has the ability to deny you what you set your mind to. I know it's super cheesy. I don't know if any of you guys got hyped on Lose Yourself by Eminem like I did back in the early 2000s. But the whole, you can do anything you set your mind to, it's like the truest statement that has ever been said. If you believe that you have the potential to achieve this version of greatness that you set your sights on, you can do it. It'll take hard work. It'll take sacrifice. It'll take determination. It'll take persevering in the face of adversity. But nobody has the power to influence your outcome except for you. So whatever you're working towards, whatever version of excellence, whatever definition of impossible you are striving towards, you are going to face obstacles. You're going to face adversity. But you have the power to stay the course, to be tenacious, to be determined, to control what you can, and to ultimately emerge victorious. It may not be on the timeline that you want. It may have external influence, people telling you that you can't do something or that you shouldn't do something or that maybe you're better off doing something else. But if you want something and you are willing to do the work for it, you can absolutely accomplish anything. And the people that I work with every single day are living examples of this. Some of the most incredible athletes on the face of the planet, some of the most remarkable clandestine special operators doing some unfathomable things all around the world every single night while we're asleep. And these people believe in themselves wholeheartedly, and you should believe in yourself too. Thank you guys so much for listening. I hope this story either inspired you to get in the pool or to take some time to go test your limits. It's an absolute pleasure to share these podcasts with you. I look forward to next week's episode when we bring back some guests, or maybe we'll tell some more Hoo-Yah stories. Let me know what you think in the comments below. And as always, stay rad.